Soul Quake. Welcome. This is what may turn out to be a series of videos that we're calling Soul Quake. And it's the thought of some, as it says, friendly Pennsylvania Quakers, and we're exploring the world of spirit. And you can see to my left, there's Dan and Ranveer and Jamie, and I'm Art. And our topic today is this book. And this book is published by Pendle Hill, which is a Quaker organization. And it's based chiefly on the writings of three people, a priest, Michael Molinos, who lived about 300 years ago, and two people who kind of were his followers in a way, Madame Guyon and Fenelon, who was a bishop. And Pendle Hill is a Quaker organization. It's in Pennsylvania. And it publishes this book, and it has a lot of other activities. And this is the book we're talking about. And as I say, it's published by a Quaker organization, but more than that, it was originally published in America in 1813, went through many editions, was widely used, especially by the Quakers. And the topic of the book is a type of prayer. It could be called the prayer of inward silence. And that's basically what we'll be talking about. And this sort of prayer we allude to is out of inward silence, where the soul is abstracted from all outward things. And I think of soul as being almost a synonym for consciousness. And so we're abstracting, we're putting our focus inside ourselves and leaving outward things alone.
The name of the book, just in case people can't see it well on their screen, is A Guide to True Peace, or the Excellency of Inward and Spiritual Prayer. Maybe you said that.
Right. Yeah, that is the title of the book. It's a kind of a long title.
Yeah.
And here they just call it A Guide to True Peace. They shorten it. And it's a small book. It's probably about 2.5 inches by 3 inches or something. But it's a book you could easily keep in your pocket. And this is from the introduction. It was written by Howard Brinton, who we'll see a little bit more about in a bit. This little book was written to nourish the spiritual life. Evidently succeeded. 12 editions between 1813 and 1877, compiled from the writings of three great mystics, Molinos, Guyon, and Fenelon. It was widely used by members of the Society of Friends. It was always printed in pocket size. And it talks about a particular kind of prayer in the prayer of inward silence. And the next two slides just give you a little idea of who Howard Brinton was. Here he is. He was very influential among the Quakers. This is Religious Society of Friends. And here's a few of his books. And so now we get back to the Guide to True Peace, which is the book we're talking about, was compiled principally from these three books. This book by Michael Molinos came first, and these two, I believe, were influenced by him. And this is the book by Madame Guyon, although it doesn't say so there, but that's her book. And Fenelon wrote this book, and as they say, Molinos wrote this. So that's the background. And what happened was Molinos wrote his book, and Guyon and Fenelon wrote theirs. And the books were quite popular for a while. And then the books became, or the movement was eventually declared heretical by the Catholic Church. And the idea here is Quietism. Well, they kind of with the Quietism could have its own episode, its own video, but it was I think tarred and feathered with things it didn't quite say. For instance, it says here that God is only known through the prayer of inward silence, when all human thought and feeling is quieted. I don't think any of them taught that. They just taught that this type of prayer was another type of prayer, and I believe some of them thought it was a higher type of prayer because it's the type of prayer that was called contemplation. In Christianity, meditation didn't mean what it means us today. It meant, say, thinking about the life of Jesus. You could imagine you were there when Jesus was being crucified or whatever. You could pray verbal prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary. But contemplation was when you left that behind, and it was kind of like your bare consciousness was trying to have contact with God, which we'll talk about more in a bit.
Well, I think it should be said that this was a political decision to condemn Quietism, and it started among members of the church hierarchy who felt that it distracted from the rituals that they presided over, and that they were really dependent on, because people would come to church for the ritual and they would make donations, and you know, so this is the support of the church. But it wasn't just the bishops and the hierarchy. The King of France felt threatened because he felt that this gave too much to the reformers, you know, like Martin Luther or somebody like that, who basically had split off from the church, and they had their own style. I'm not saying Quietism was exactly the same, because it wasn't, but Quietism presented the same threat. And so the King of France sent his ambassador to the Pope and said, you know, this has got to go. We can't have this. And you know, that was a very strong lobbying kind of a factor for the Pope, because he in those days was not just the prince of the church. He was a secular power, and they had their own government. They were independent of the Italian governments, and so he said, okay, you know, let's get rid of Quietism, and that was that.
Yeah.
Did you say that Molinos was locked up when 9 years in the slammer before he died?
And Madame Guyon was imprisoned 7, 8, 9 years, something like that. She was imprisoned a fair amount of time also. Madame Guyon and Fenelon both submitted to the church and retracted what they said in the end to avoid, well, I'm not exactly sure what they were avoiding, but I'm sure it wasn't good. And after we've talked more about the prayer of quiet, maybe we can get back to how it threatened the church. But yeah, it certainly did. Anyway, it says here, the movement had a strong influence on the Society of Friends, whose teaching were closely akin. And let's see what the next slide says. The next slide says more about Quietism, but then we'll get back to the actual prayer itself. Now, as I say, this is some of the stuff I think is unfair, and some of it is somewhat fair. Perfection consists in a passivity of the soul. Well, the idea there was that if you're having an experience of God, then naturally you might just, you know, be submissive to what God was doing. And that's one way to say it, I think. So there was some truth to the idea of doing the prayer of quiet. It's a prayer of passivity in some sense, but we can get back to that in a bit. it says quietist elements have been found in Christian and non-Christian movements. As I said, Molinos was the one who kind of brought the revival in Christianity or in Catholicism until he was condemned as a heretic. And it talks here how quietism occurs in Protestantism, and it mentions man and Guyon, and Fenelon was an archbishop. And this, as I said, both Guyon and Fenelon were condemned by the Pope, and they both submitted. They said, okay, you're right, we're wrong.
Just in case our listeners don't know, the all this was going on pretty much at the same time Quakerism was developing in England.
Yeah.
George Fox was born in 1624, I think, and Molinos a few years later. But they both came of age at more or less the same time.
Right.
And they had pretty much of a free period of expression, but both movements were persecuted. In England, the Quakers were persecuted starting toward the mid 1650s, I think. And it says here that Pope Innocent put down his condemnation in 1699, so that was some years later. But there was resistance to Quietism probably decades before that.
Yeah.
In the church.
Yeah.
Now, I guess we're going to talk in detail about quietism and just the notion of it rather than the the historical aspect of it. And there'll be things to say about it.
Well, this today we talk mostly about the prayer of quiet and I think quietism could use its own video, but let's get on to the prayer of quiet and then maybe circle back to quietism if we have an idea of what the prayer of quiet is. And I believe that's here. So here is from the introduction by Howard Brinton. I'm sorry. There we go. Kind of jumped a bit. Okay, so here's the introduction by Howard Brinton. And the idea is that when a person is in say Christianity, often that consists of going to church, singing hymns, praying in public, reciting an Our Father or Hail Mary, whatever. If you're Catholic, you get to see the Mass, which is a ritual that you see repeated. You're in an environment with maybe stained glass windows and incense and all that kind of stuff, and an altar. And that is fine, but some, especially monks, would achieve contemplation. And contemplation would be when they had an experience of God within themselves. And that's what Howard Brinton is saying here. Divine presence is known by a direct, immediate glance of the soul. And under that, we have the definition of mysticism, the experience of direct communion. Now, the reason why this says ultimate reality is because that's one way to talk about God. And so the idea is to have a direct experience of God is the goal. And to do that, some contemplatives, some monks found that it was useful to put aside thought and to just go within themselves and, we'll see in another slide what they were trying to do. Yeah, sorry.
May I make a comment here?
Sure.
So it's very kind of reminiscent of non-dualism in Vedanta, where the finite self, because it is separated from the infinite self, the ultimate reality, is always trying to get back to the infinite self. And the way you reach that spot is, again, through subjective introspection, or when the conditions are such that there's no distraction from the quote unquote outside created world.
Yeah.
And that's, they call it the Satchit Ananda. That's the Ananda, the blissful state. And it seems like if you take the word God out and talk about the incessant effort to have direct communion with ultimate reality, it's like coming full circle to what Vedanta says.
I think it's very similar. Yeah. The idea of God as a person is a common one. Jesus, Krishna, even Allah and Yahweh are persons in the sense that they have desires, they have wishes, they have commands. But the idea of God as ultimate reality, as subsistent being, is not as well known, but it does occur in all religions, including Christianity. And also the idea of going inward is really, I mean, you can imagine people who want to think about a problem and they don't want any distractions. Sherlock Holmes, when he was working on a case, would go play his violin and just kind of like try to forget everything and concentrate. So the idea of just trying to avoid distractions and concentrate occurs, not only in this kind of prayer, but it's a common idea.
Yeah, I certainly. And I think it should be said also that when it says we must look within, not without, basically, I mean, everything is inside, really. I mean, it's just a matter of where your consciousness lies. Is it on the sensory nodes, let's say, things going on in the environment, but usually it's actually thoughts. So the idea is just pulling back from the thoughts and going within. That sounds like an effort. If you're going, it's not falling within, it's going within. We must look within. I would say the emphasis is just not on the routine human proclivity of constant thought and distraction. And I also wonder if Quietism captures the whole thing, because there's a lot of aspects where it's not, I would say it's not quiet. I mean, it could be being close to a waterfall, for example, or by the ocean, or it could be a music or chanting. I mean, there's a number of ways to get beyond your, let's say, mundane self with that quiet. And to me, the emphasis is just pulling back from our normal proclivity of distraction. I mean, well, all the things that go on in the mind.
Yeah.
And also, again, back to Christianity with my limited knowledge of it, Jesus, his basis of popularity and unpopularity in the times that he was living was that he proclaimed that the kingdom of God is within us.
Yeah.
That's where you want to strive your efforts for, which is in sharp contrast, again, with my limited knowledge of the Bible, is the God of the Old Testament essentially is out there espousing more children, more offspring, wealth, control over other tribes, and this, that, and whatnot. All of it was being touted as the goal of worship. And Jesus turns around and says, this, the kingdom that you want to seek is within you. And again, it again circles back to what we were talking about here, the direct communion and inward presence.
Yeah.
Do you guys see the same way? Like I'm viewing the shift or the tergiversation from the God of the Old Testament to Jesus's approach.
Oh, certainly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people note that the God of the Old Testament and the God of and what Jesus teaches don't agree very well. That it seems like it seems like there's a big change when Jesus comes, and a change in the view of God. Of course, Jesus teaches, I think, God is a loving Father, and the Old Testament view, God was more or less someone to be feared, I think.
Well, maybe that's why there's a PhD program, or thousands of them, I guess, on theology, Christian theology, and the Bible, because if you don't study it real hard, all those differences are going to be hard to explain.
Yeah.
So it's trying to find common ways to explain these things that really almost commonsensically don't pair up very well.
Oh, and by the way, Jamie, you had said something earlier about like walking by the beach and whatever. And yeah, I in my reading, the Molinos and company never said this was the only way. They said this was a way, and I think that it was unfair to criticize Quietism as presenting it as, well, this is the only way to pray or whatever. I think this is best thought of as just another way that.
Okay, but and even the definition, maybe just because it's used to the word quiet, and it certainly implies that you need to be quiet, but it could just mean quiet from the incessant chatter of the brain in the normal way that humans do.
Yeah.
On that point of there, are various ways. I don't think you should just brush off the Old Testament, even though the way we perceive it, which is by this old book that is just as interested in the history of this tribe, which with all its conflicts and kings and scandals and whatnot. But cropping up from time to time in that book, that there are stories about prophets, and they must have had some sort of connection with God because they were strongly moved, and it's very likely it's not the same kind of connection that we see Molinos talking about.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide. Here again, now this is from the book, A Guide to True Peace, and it talks more about the prayer of inward silence. And the only problem I have with this is silence all desires and wandering imaginations of the mind. That verb, for me, I can't silence my desires and imagination of the mind. I kind of have to wait them out. I mean, I sit there till they quiet down, but I can't sit there and say, okay, I'm going to silence all my desires and my imaginations. That doesn't work. But anyway, once the desires and the imaginations do quiet down, however that happens, they say, in this profound silence of the whole soul, we may hearken to the voice of God. It is a still small voice. So the idea here is that God is speaking to us, but not that loudly. And if we want to watch TV or something, fine, then we don't hear that voice because we've decided to occupy ourselves otherwise. But the prayer of silence is an inward silence, and you could do that walking on the beach. You could do that. Just if your mind is clear and receptive, I don't think it matters really what your body's doing.
I agree with you. I mean, silence, that's sort of a command that you're giving yourself. Be silent,
Yeah.
to attend to what is, let's say, in the core of your being. Well, okay, but how do you do that? And, now there's all kinds of techniques, but none of them, I don't think, are very effective at providing an easy pathway to, other than, drugs, psychedelics, or something like that. An easy pathway to let go of this incessant brain chatter. So yeah, it's one thing to say that, and some people may barely have the ability to do that. I mean, if you're in a crisis, or if you have trauma or what have you, it's one thing to say to do that, but it's not a practical way to go about it, just to maintain the silence. I mean, that's where techniques come into play, and they may or may not be effective.
Well, you don't jump into it, you practice it, you work at it. Mm-hmm. And I see a striking similarity between what we have here on the screen and what Buddha said. And Buddhism says that, the name for that in Pali is dukkha. The source of dukkha is the chasing of the desires and wandering imagination. But the beauty of Buddhism is that Buddha pinpoints the problem and then right away offers a solution. And the solution is to practice meditation. And it has to be an incessant effort. It doesn't happen by praying. You have to practice and practice. And then you begin to see, again using the Buddhist term, the impermanence of what we are all chasing, which again cycles back to dukkha.
The Molinos and company were around 1600. There is a book called The Cloud of Unknowing, which I believe is the 1400s, and it was very popular in England. And it had a similar idea. The idea of unknowing was a mental state where, again, there's a silencing of thoughts and desires, and you're in a state of receptivity. And this whole mental prayer goes back very far. This guy with this long name is about 400 AD, and it goes back at least that far. Very interesting history. Maybe I'll just give a word about this. His name was Dionysius. St. Paul, it says in the Bible, converted a member of the Senate of Athens, and the Senate of Athens was the Areopagus. So St. Paul converted Dionysius the Areopagite, which would be like converting Dionysius the senator. So that was a big deal. Somewhere around 400 AD, someone wrote a book claiming to be Dionysius the Areopagite, but he wasn't, because it was 400 years later. So he's called Pseudo-Dionysius. It's kind of an interesting historical tale, but the idea is that the prayer of silence can be found going back over 1,000 years among various writers. And also it goes back to St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila were declared by the Roman Catholic Church to be doctors of the church, and they talked about it also.
Did you say doctors?
Yes, the phrase is doctors of the church. There's I believe, 33 men and women who are considered doctors of the church. And what that means is that someone can be a saint, like Mother Teresa, and care for the sick, but doctrinally, they might not be a theologian. They might just be a simple, loving person that does what they believe they're supposed to do, and they become a saint. But some writers were considered so authoritative, like St. Augustine. Like what they wrote was considered dogma, or at least very, and they were called doctors of the church, of the Roman Catholic Church. And St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila are two of them. And they talked about a prayer of quiet also. So there's a lot of interesting history we can get into eventually about this.
Well, I have to say that just my reaction to the title of this book, I guess it is, The Cloud of Unknowing. Man, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think of other ways to express it, like non-specific. I can't even say it. Not being non-specific. In other words, it's pulling away from the focus. Because the focus is always a mind trap. So you can say, like in prayer, the focus is what have you, but any kind of focus really can be a mind trap there. And I'm not saying certainly the I don't know, Ron Beer, what do you call those or anybody when mystics, when they go into heavy action to do almost supernatural things.
Some kind of science?
What is it?
Science?
No. I mean, this is an Eastern term. But I can't think of the term.
Or samadhi, maybe?
Yeah, well, I don't know. But the idea that is the brain is always looking for the specific, and that's just a trap in a way, from this idea of going beyond the locality into non-locality. Just not. It's funny because at the same time there are such things as guided meditations, and they're trying to sort of do that. They are very specific, but I think the idea is that you're not creating that. That's coming from the outside. So it's like a tool, and it's sort of more of an experiment is the way I see it.
Okay. No, okay. So here again is some more quotes from the book that we're talking about. And again, inward silence abstracted from all outward things. And you should be your frequent practice. To fix your mind in peace and silence, quitting your own reasonings and not willing to think about anything. So again, it's I think of it as being conscious, but not conscious of thoughts or emotions, just like pure consciousness in a way. That's receptive to what is called the still small voice of God. And I notice here it says, thoughts present themselves, you should gently turn from them, which, as I said, I can't sit and silence my thoughts like I could go eat a sandwich or something. I mean, it's not that, it's kind of like I have to wait them out. But so patiently wait to feel the divine presence. So
I would say that probably with most people, just speaking for myself, it's an on again, off again thing. Even if you're having let's say your typical meditation that you might do on a regular basis, or maybe not. Yeah, there are periods where the mind is just chattering away, and sometimes, especially in the beginning of each session, it's, especially if something's going on in you, it's just hard to let that go. But then maybe there are increasing periods where you actually do let that go. You can see the tenacious hold, and sometimes it's just a matter of looking at the tenacious hold, and then hopefully dropping that and defocusing from there.
Yeah.
And also, maybe in those times, there were fewer distractions compared to what we are faced with.
Yeah.
And even at that, at least in the Indian tradition, the emphasis always has been on seclusion, whether it's a cave in the Himalayas or a quiet place in the jungle or wherever. The whole idea was to get away from it so that you would be faced with fewer distractions.
Yeah. You know, it occurred to me once that some of the teachings of Jesus can be seen as helping this type of prayer. I mean, the thing about if you go to the altar, but you have a problem with your brother, just go and like, forgive your brother, and well, just forgiveness. And if someone takes something from you, just, if someone takes your cloak, give him, if someone forces you to walk a mile, walk two. The idea if you follow that when you sit, in other words, if you don't follow that when you sit, you might find yourself filled with resentment and anger, and that person shouldn't have done this, and this person shouldn't have done that. And if you want to value sitting in silence and peace, you would say, well, I'm just going to forgive. I'm going to forget that. I'm going to let it go because I don't want it to disturb my prayer. So I think that some of the teachings of Jesus can be seen as serving to promote this kind of prayer.
Well, it's funny how we've now thrown the word prayer into it, and we haven't really defined that or described it, but I don't think we did. But it is coming up as a synonym for what we've been talking about quietism. Is that the way that it's meant here, and do you have other ideas about it?
Well, my idea is we're talking about the prayer of inward silence. Quietism could have its own video, and as Dan said earlier, I believe it was a condom. Quietism is the charge that was put against this kind of prayer for at least partially political reasons, and they might not have done justice to what this prayer is. They might have, mischaracterized it so they could condemn it. So I would just say we're talking about the prayer of inward silence, and quietism is a whole issue in itself. Right? That's what I would say, a whole other issue. So
aren't we talking about the same thing though? I mean,
the thing,
in this sense,
I would say it's not the same thing, because suppose I mischaracterize it. Like you're praying, suppose I say, well, this person says that the only way to God is to sit in silence, and you should never go to the church. You should never, like, that would be mischaracterizing the prayer of inward silence. And I think that quietism was kind of like that. It was kind of like a mischaracterization, but I really don't know. I'd have to. I think
so you mean like quietism, the movement, rather than the practice?
What goes by the name of quietism?
Right.
By the way, here's something. There's a book by Aldous Huxley, who Aldous Huxley says that the reaction to quietism, basically, he implies it was an overreaction, and he says it basically killed contemplative practice for 2 centuries in Christianity, because it was an overreaction against contemplative prayer. And there's Christian article I can find which says the same thing. And then in the 1970s, when Eastern gurus were getting a lot of followers, two Catholic priests, Thomas Keating and Basil Pennington, revived something they call centering prayer. And they said, we're reviving something that Christianity has lost. And I think it was lost when quietism was condemned. But all this stuff I'd have to double check, and maybe we could do a video on it separately. But there's a lot of historical stuff here that we could explore in the future. Should I go on? Next slide.
Sure.
Here again, they did like the prayer of inward silence, though, the easiest and most profitable path. So they did like it. They weren't excluding other types of prayer, but they were saying this is really, it really works well. They were really, Molinos and company were really promoters of it. And here again, it's saying what we've said before, basically. It is for want of inward retirement and prayer that our lives are so imperfect. The silence of all our earthly thoughts and desires is absolutely indispensable if we would hear the secret voice of the divine instructor. So what they're saying basically is if you desire to have a direct experience of God, a mystical experience, or something close to that, one way to do it. Well, here they're saying it's absolutely indispensable. But anyway, at least one way to do it is to sit in quiet and attempt to quiet or wait till your thoughts and desires quiet and listen to that small voice.
And I think that this happens probably routinely for many, Christian people that go to church or mass, and they sit quietly, receptively, and that is their refuge. And sometimes I think, I mean, I certainly know Catholics that wouldn't think about the idea of meditating every morning, for example, or what have you. But they are very into going to mass. And I believe that they do get something out of it. And I think that this inward silence is part of it.
I would have a comment that, it supports this idea of the cloud of unknowing and the ability of silence to produce inward connections with the spirit. Because if you have a modern perspective and you're educated in science now, the basic way all physical entities come into being is by a condensation from a cloud of different possibilities. And those possibilities are in what's called a superposition, which is, a superposition is just a big cloud of all kinds of possibilities. And what happens is when something actually comes into existence, and this is science, okay, that cloud of unknowing or that cloud of superposition condenses energy into a structure. And it does that when it measures the different elements that are out there, which it pulls together into that structure. And so you have quantum measurement and quantum superposition. And those are modern ideas which are really saying the same thing as what these guys are talking about.
So you're talking about a collapse of the structure, then, right?
Well, I'm talking about something coming out of the cloud of unknowing, coming out as a particular thought, which is guided by spirit. Spirit being the quantum measurement. The spirit coming into your mind, it's what it's done, it's measured what's already in your mind, and it pulls the disparate threads together into a new thought, which is spiritually motivated or spiritually cohesive.
So I was going along with the idea that this what are we calling this, cloud of unknowing? It takes a collapse of this cloud before you can reach a thought. And so, in other words, you're getting from non-specific. I can never say it. Non-specificity to specific, and that's where the brain really taps in and the ideas come, right? But the non-specific, the cloud of unknown, is more the let's call it the prayerful state. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, but where does it lead you? It leads you to some spiritual insight.
Well, it may not lead you anywhere, and that might be the spiritual insight. You know, that it's not, it's a state rather than
You're going to get really bored if it doesn't lead you anywhere.
well, I bet not if it's a state. I would
Oh, okay, yeah, I can see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mentioned St. John of the Cross, doctor of the church. He talked about the prayer of inward silence. He was before Molinos. And he also wrote a rather famous book called The Dark Night of the Soul. And the idea is, well, one view of this is that when you try to do this prayer of inward silence, it can be very boring. It can be very frustrating at times. You can do it and feel nothing. You might feel like you're just not in contact with your thoughts or your emotions. You're not in contact with God. You're just sitting and, wasting time. And here, it might seem that we labor to no purpose, that the prayer of inward silence is an attainment, but our imagination is so ungovernable and our minds are so void of good. And St. John said that this state of dryness was profitable because if you kind of like, if you get through it, if you persist, that in itself is a worthy thing. I guess no pain, no gain kind of idea. I don't know. But it ends up here that, in other words, I guess what he's saying, going by this, is that basically if you're trying, that in itself is a good. Right? So the Bhagavad Gita has this idea about give up the fruits of the actions, like you do what you do because it's right, and how it turns out is beyond your control, so don't worry about it. Something like that. It kind of, I think, is what is being said here in a way.
If you think about Quaker meetings,
Yeah.
it's often said that the people who sit there in silence and never say anything are actually very important. And I mean, some people are moved to speak. So that's when the cloud of unknowing condenses a thought that you want to speak, and
Yeah.
you're inspired to speak.
Yeah.
But those who don't speak, they're doing something that's just as important.
Yeah. That's good. That's good.
Like Milton said, they also serve who only stand and wait.
Yeah.
That's in Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
So this is, again, I mean, it just, in a way, so exhilarating to see these writings of 1500 years ago that ring such a loud bell of what we are dealing with in our present time. The thing about mindfulness and the meditation that some of the Buddhist monks like Thich Nhat Hanh preach, and no question about it, it's not as exciting as thumbing through your Facebook pages or having dinner in the evening with a bottle of wine or whatever. Or going to a retreat, that is organized for the rich and wealthy. This is boring stuff, and the whole idea is, again, back to practice. Then you begin to see Ananda once you get past the distractions. So
Right.
there's a reward at the end of the rainbow, but you have to. There are no shortcuts.
Yeah.
What's Ananda?
Ananda is literal translation, which is crude, is bliss. Bliss.
Bliss. BLISS.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I should mention that just for people who don't know, that we are Quakers of the type where we sit in silence doing our services until someone feels led to speak. But there are other Quakers who have ministers, and they're more of a closer to other Protestant denominations. But what we're talking about here is we meet and we sit until someone feels like speaking. And if no one speaks, that's fine too. So that's just for people who maybe aren't acquainted with Quakers. That's
I guess the term is the non-programmed.
right, right. We're non-programmed Quakers. That's right. That's right. Okay. I think yes, this is the last slide, and there is a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. Brother Lawrence was a monk, and he worked in the kitchen, and he was somewhat of an oaf, they said. He kind of would break things, but apparently he had a very continual presence of the presence of God. And this quote is from the book we're talking about, The Guide to True Peace, but it talks about that if you're faithful with this exercise, eventually you'll enjoy a continual presence of God. And that's why this book is here, because they're talking about the same thing. So it seems like a good note to end on.
Well, before we end, this line, the last line of this paragraph,
Yeah.
be still and know that I am God. I think it's one of the most profound lines I think this occurs in the New Testament, am I right? Jesus is saying that. Am I correct?
I thought it was the Old Testament, but I'm not really sure.
Okay, in any case,
Yeah.
Again, if you look at the letter or word I, and I here takes me all the way back to consciousness.
Yeah.
And in some crude sorts of ways, it solves my hiccup about the baggage in the word called God. In other words, I can safely substitute the word consciousness or being and get away from the God baggage.
Yeah.
How do you guys feel about that?
I'm going to read the paragraph if that's okay, just because I think it's helpful if anybody can't see it. The soul that is faithful in the exercise of that love and adherence to God already described is astonished to feel Him actually taking possession of its whole being, and now enjoys a continual sense that presence which has become, as it were, natural to it. The presence diffuses an unusual serenity throughout all our facilities. It calms the mind and gives sweet repose and quiet, even in the midst of our daily labors. But then we must be resigned to Him without reserve. Be still and know that I am God. You know, I have to look at that for a little bit. I've always had a problem with the male pronoun and the hymns and that sort of thing. And that I am God. See, that's a little ambiguous the way it's stated. To me, it is. Know that I am God. I don't know if that is speaking from another entity or speaking from the point of view of the mind, or whatever. So I don't know.
By the way, that's from Psalm 46, which is like a Hebrew song that in the whole Old Testament.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
And also, I have a question. I was kind of staring at it. So the word him, the last sentence, but then we must be resigned to Him without reserve.
Yeah.
Is Him referring to God without a capital H, or is He referring to something else?
I think it's referring to God, and it's using the male pronoun, which is common, even if, yeah, I think it is.
So it does not have the capital H.
Well, I copied this out of the book, and either it's a typo or that's the way it is in the book. I believe that's the way it is. I did check.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's also quite notable of the word "it's," because it says the soul, blah, 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 is astonished to feel him gradually taking possession of its whole being. So we're masculinizing God, and we're objectifying the person, I think, is what I'm getting out of that, but I could be off. It's just an unusual arrangement of words there. I need to process that.
Well, it's kind of older English, because I was struck by the word importunate. Remember in the previous slide?
Oh,
The word importunate. And I had to Google it, and the meaning is persistent to the point of annoyance or intrusion. Basically, it's talking about be persistent.
yeah.
Stay with it.
In spite of the language, which, you know, some of us might object to, the male pronoun and all, it seems to me the message is really simple, which is that, you know, if you get to the point where you're no longer seeking, you have found a sense of, you know, this is the reality. This is what we are. We are really spiritual beings. At that point, your mind is, I mean, you're not going to be a depressed person anymore. You're going to see the world in a different light. It's like, look around you. Nature, our world is really the Garden of Eden, and we're its creatures, and nothing to worry about, because sweet repose and quiet. We know who we are and where we're going.
The sage has bespoken. No, truly, that's very true, what you just said. Very well said.
Well, is that a good note to end on?
Yes,
I think
words
it's
of
an
the
excellent one.
sage are a good concluding point.
Yeah. Well, okay. So quick.